Hello everyone, and welcome to the third and final part of this A-10 build. In the last video we marbled, added panel lines, worked on the camouflage, and also worked on things such as the nose and tail flash. We then ended off with a clear coat, and that's going to leave us here. So although the decals that were included in the kit were pretty good, I decided that I was going to use some custom decals that I got offline. These decals were for an aircraft, the Panthers of the 353rd Tactical Fighter Squadron based at Myrtle Beach of the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing. This group went into action during the Gulf War. But as I began decaling, I found that the custom decals were extremely fragile, and even if almost no pressure was put on them, they'd fall apart. This meant that for much of the decals I used on this plane, I had to use the Hobby Boss decals, which was relatively fine as these decals were pretty good. The only problem was when dealing with smaller decals such as these, the film on the outer edges was extremely big and so would not allow the decals to fit properly onto the aircraft. Even when cutting off the film though, there were issues. Tended to break apart, but this was okay as almost all the other decals that were relatively bigger worked out perfectly fine and had almost to no silvering and looked really good on the aircraft and conformed really well to the panel lines and rivets. So out of all the decals that came in the custom set, this was the most important, as this was the patch for the 353rd Tactical Fighter Squadron, which would become extremely important later when I built the base. Though the decals were very hard to work with, I still tried to use as many of them as I could, including these kill marks. Tried to include the 354th wing patch, but as you can see here, it started falling apart. And after the aircraft fell off its stand, it continued to fall apart, which made it extremely hard to work with, so I decided I'll just scrap it and keep with the squadron patch. So although the aircraft in question for the custom decals did not have a shark mouth, it's something that kind of is identified with the A-10 in this modern era, so I decided to include it in this kit. I was extremely satisfied with how the decals came out, as there was no silvering other than the MB for the Myrtle Beach tail flash, which came from the custom decal set, but these were very hard to put on, so I accepted it and moved on. But overall the decals looked great. And to seal in these decals and make sure they were protected from any other paint or materials, I then sprayed a gloss coat. After giving the lacquer gloss coat a day to dry, I then moved on to the oil wash. I'd be using some black oil paint along with some odorless mineral spirits. To make the wash, I first poured in some mineral spirits into this little bottle cap, and then I added in some paint slowly with a brush. After making the wash, then I applied it liberally to the entirety of the aircraft. I made sure to get each nook and cranny, and also didn't apply much to the canopy as I was afraid it would leak through the tape or make the tape less sticky. After applying it and letting it dry for about 5 hours, I then started wiping it off using a dampened towel with mineral spirits and a little bit of effort. Most of this was off camera as it took an extreme amount of time, but in the end it looked great and definitely unified the entirety of the aircraft and kind of brought all the colors together. So I was extremely satisfied with this wash, and I'll continue to use this technique. Now that we're done painting and adding effects to the aircraft, it's time for munitions. I started off by picking out a couple munitions I wanted to add, including the ALQ-191, Sidewinders, some cluster bombs, and also some Mavericks. Later I decided to add a GBU-10, but the fit of all these were relatively good other than the GBU-10, as it was a little bit iffy towards the front. But I have to say the Mavericks went together extremely well, and with a little bit of tape, they had very little seams and the gaps were minimal. After building munitions, I then painted all required ones olive drab XF62, and then painted the Sidewinders a light gray whitish color. I also used this for the ALQ-191. If there was one thing about this kit that I absolutely hated, it was the munitions decals. They were absolutely atrocious, and they went easily on, but in the end they looked totally horrible and silvered almost immediately. But once I got on the weapons such as the A-10, I started feeling a little bit more confident as the aircraft started to look a little bit better. These sidewinders were something that I was extremely proud of, as to me they looked really good. Instead of using the decals for the red and yellow lines, I then went ahead and painted them myself, and they ended up looking pretty good. So I was definitely happy with that. Here on the Mark 20 cluster bombs, we can see exactly why I hated the munitions decals. They did not go on very well at all, and the film looked really horrible. In addition to the fact that they actually didn't even fit the bombs they were supposed to be on. That was kind of something that annoyed me a little bit. So I then went back and painted them green, as I did some research and found most Mark 20 bombs are painted green during the Gulf War. But they ended up looking pretty good, so I was satisfied, and they filled a rack. Finally, it was time to paint the ALQ-191. It had a little bit of tedious masking, but in the end it looked pretty good, so I was definitely satisfied, and it kind of brought all the munitions together. Alright, and here we have her with all the munitions. If there's one thing the A-10 is known for other than the Gal-8, it's definitely the munitions. I did not decide to use some Mavericks though, because as you can see, the decals went on horribly and they looked more like stickers than markings, so they were something I omitted. But in the end, it still looked really good with the munitions it had, so I was definitely satisfied. And finally, to tie together the entirety of the kit with the building procedures, I then built the landing gear. The rubber wheels made this very easy, as there was no masking required on the landing gear, which made for these steps to go by very quickly. The fit of the doors in the actual aircraft was relatively well, and other than some slight discoloration with the different paints, it went together pretty easily and definitely tied it all together. So in the end it looked good and definitely tied it all together. So now we're going to do some slight weathering. First we're going to add some scratches onto the refueling port, as the boom would slightly scratch this area when it contacted. Then we're going to add some oil stains from the wheel well. It was very hard to see it, but it definitely felt good to at least add that, in addition to some scrapes around where the pilot would enter the aircraft. I then added some soot using some oil paints to the gun area, and then finally we were done with the very short weathering. But it did add some little details and looked pretty good. I then sealed everything in with a final coat of gloss coat. I then started taking off the mask on the windows, which is definitely something that I always like. It's pretty satisfying and I definitely like doing it. The one thing I have to say is there were a couple floaties, just some lint in the cockpit, which made me really mad, but it wasn't very noticeable unless you were staring at it, so it looked pretty good. I finished the aircraft off by adding smaller parts such as the lights, and of course I had to add the gun. This was definitely very satisfying to end the build off with the giant Gatling gun, and I was very happy. So here she is, the completed aircraft. But one thing you might have noticed is I have the gears up. So what am I gonna exactly do about that? Well, we're gonna make a base using this wood and an acrylic arm I found online. And after some drilling and some staining, I was left with this really nice base. But there was an issue: how am I going to fix the aircraft to the base? Well, that is where we have magnets come in. So we have this little magnetic piece that attaches to the base, but we need to attach this to the aircraft. We're going to be doing this by first heating it up with a lighter, and then we're going to put it into the actual aircraft. After a little bit of cleanup, this looked great. I did love how it looked, but it was missing one thing. The base looked a little bit boring. So that's where this patch comes in. So this is the patch of the 353rd TFS, and it's almost identical to the one on the actual aircraft. So using some double-sided tape, I then affixed this patch onto the base of the stand. So this is going to mark the end of the build. Thank you all so much for watching and all your support. Please tell me what you think about this aircraft down below. But with that, I'll see you in the next video.